Hey everybody, and welcome to Part-Time Tabletopper. My name is Adam, and I've got another very cool step-by-step tutorial for you guys this week. So I know the other week I did that post-build review of that epic 2-month-long project I worked on, the Moat House from the Temple of Elemental Evil, and that was great, but I want to get back to my normal routine of giving you guys a step-by-step tutorial so that you can make something at home for your own gaming boards. Now, the story behind this one is that somebody reached out to me and said that they wanted a Lunar terrain board for their sci-fi campaign, which I don't normally play sci-fi games, not because I'm not into them, but because I haven't really had the opportunity to be introduced to one, or friends who want to play a tabletop sci-fi game. So I didn't have any terrain for this. I didn't have any past experience making sci-fi terrain, but I'm super glad they reached out and asked because it did give me an opportunity to make something that I wouldn't have normally made before. So the results, I think, are very cool. I think that an intermediate to even beginner crafter can make this depending on the style and technique that you use. Really, the materials do so much of the work for you that I think this is a great step to doing beginner terrain boards. Especially if you want to get into sci-fi gaming. So without further ado, let's get into the build, and I'm really excited to show this one to you guys. We're going to start off with some 1-inch thick XPS foam glued onto some plywood as our base. We're also going to take some spare styrofoam that we're going to use for our hills, and we're going to carve those out with a utility knife. Also, you're going to need some kind of an adhesive to glue the base together, as well as glue those hills on. There's tacky glue, construction adhesive, or even wood glue. You're also going to need some rock molds from Woodland Scenics, which you can see an example of what those look like here using plaster, as well as a heat gun to create some craters. So here I've chosen wood glue as my adhesive for the plywood base in that XPS foam. If you're making multiple boards, to make sure they line up later, it's always important to make sure that the edges are either flush with the XPS foam or the XPS even hangs over a little bit, and then weigh it down. So skipping ahead a little bit, let's talk about some pieces, and again, you can see that everything is flat and dry here now. So, the first thing I want to talk about is the hills. I use construction adhesive to use 2 1/2-inch thick pieces of styrofoam to create a little bit of an elevation, and use construction adhesive to put them down. Then, I carve the edges out with a utility blade here, and you can see I didn't try to get perfect, just make sure there's some kind of a slope. Then, I used a heat gun to make those craters right there, which is why it's important to use that 1-inch thick XPS foam base so you have a little bit of give, and I also put some on top of the hills. Finally, I also used that construction adhesive to glue the plaster rock molds on, and this is just going to help our next step have some rocks that stand out a bit more. Now we're going to be making a ground texture that's very rocky out of plaster, and to give it that rocky effect, we're going to add some of this green fiber insulation, which is made completely out of recycled material, and mixes very well with the plaster of Paris that we're going to use to give us that great ground texture. Now with a handful of that insulation and a bowl of plaster all mixed together, let's start applying it. Also, please use a mask when you're working with plaster or insulation. Now here's a close-up of me putting that plaster mix around one of the craters that I'd made. If you ever look at a moon crater, you'll notice that the edges are built up a little bit from the impact, and so I wanted to create that same look here with my craters. Now if you see any plaster hanging over the edges, be sure to pick that off now while it's easy to do, because you want your edges to line up with your other boards if you have multiple boards. Here's the finished effect, and also make sure if you did use any of those rock molds, don't cover them up with the plaster because you'll lose the effect. Now, because that insulation does weaken our plaster mix, I am going to use black paint and Mod Podge to cover it up just as an extra layer of protection. I'm also going to use a bare Lunar surface, very specific color spray paint for my Lunar surface board, as well as some black paint to paint the edges and do some finishing touches. I've skipped ahead a little bit so you didn't have to watch me do the whole Mod Podge layer, but again, this is me finishing it up, and this is what it looks like completely covered. So like I said, I'm using a very specific bare spray paint called Lunar Surface. It stood out to me on the shelf, and you can see when I apply it here, the color looks great. I'm coming in at a 45-degree angle from just one direction so that there's some shadows and some depth to the board. The words of a former astronomy teacher who saw this said the color was spot on. Then, just for looks, I've cleaned up the edges with some black paint. Just for fun, I made some extra scatter hills using the same techniques here to go along with the board, and I also have a few pictures here of some scatter terrain that's going with the board as well to give it some pop of color and go with the sci-fi gaming. And that's it. That's how you guys make a lunar terrain board. It really is that simple. This was one of my shorter terrain videos I think I've done, and there's a reason for that. Really, the techniques are not that intense. It's something that even with just a little bit of practice, even an inexperienced crafter could make that without any problems. That plaster and that insulation mix really do so much of the work, and then the fact that it's a very neutral tone that doesn't involve a lot of in-depth colors, even the painting with that spray paint is really honestly very simple. So I hope you guys found this helpful. If you guys make your own lunar terrain boards, let me know. I want to know how they turn out, and I look forward to whatever the next crafting tutorial that I make for you is. So until then, I will see you guys then. Bye.